Let's delve into the comparison between Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, and modern leaders through a comprehensive and continuous analysis of the parallels between his governance style and contemporary political strategies. In this video, we'll highlight how Augustus' tactics for stabilizing and throughout expanding the Roman Empire resonate with 21st century leaders, both in democracies and more authoritarian regimes. Augustus took control of Rome during a period of great political and social instability. The Republic was collapsing after years of civil war, and the institutions that once ensured order had lost their effectiveness. What Augustus did brilliantly was to understand that in order to consolidate his power in a lasting way, he needed more than military victories or political alliances. He needed to reform the very foundations of the Roman system, making his actions seem both necessary and legitimate. This strategy of reforming and restructuring institutions in times of crisis is something we see reflected in many contemporary leaders. Today, many leaders face economic, social, or political crises that threaten the stability of their countries. Like Augustus, these leaders often use moments of crisis to justify sweeping reforms that increase their power and control. A classic example of this is how many governments used the 2008 economic crisis to reform the financial system, while simultaneously consolidating greater control over markets and financial regulation. Just as Augustus presented himself as the restorer of order in a time of chaos, modern leaders use crises to frame their reforms as essential for future stability and prosperity. One of Augustus' main reforms was establishing the Pax Romana, a period of relative peace and stability that lasted over 200 years. He achieved this peace through a combination of diplomacy, military strength, and a redefinition of the empire's borders. He understood that internal stability largely depended on keeping external threats in check and ensuring a stable social order. Similarly, contemporary leaders, like the presidents of the United States or Russia, frequently invoke the idea of national stability, whether through economic reforms or foreign policy, to justify actions that strengthen their internal power. The idea of security, both internal and external, is often used to gain popular support, just as Augustus did when he promised peace and security to the Roman people. Another important aspect of Augustus was his masterful use of propaganda. He meticulously controlled his image, portraying himself as a benevolent leader, a savior of the Republic, and eventually as a father of the country. This was done through monuments, like the Arapaces, and coins that always depicted him in positions of power and divinity. Modern leaders, although using different means like mass media, social networks, and marketing campaigns, follow a similar logic. They build narratives about themselves and their governments that shape public perception and consolidate their power. In the digital age, the ability to control a leader's image is even more crucial than in Augustus' time. Modern political campaigns are deeply rooted in crafting a careful public image. Social networks allow political leaders to speak directly to the public, bypassing intermediaries, much like Augustus used iconography to directly shape his image before the Roman people. Just as he used art and culture to solidify his legitimacy, modern leaders use the media to create narratives that keep them in power, regardless of political criticism. We can observe this image control in leaders like Vladimir Putin, who uses his country's media to portray himself as a defender of Russia and a restorer of its lost glory. Similarly, Donald Trump, during his presidency, used social media in unprecedented ways to communicate directly with his base, avoiding the filter of traditional press and controlling the narrative around his presidency. These examples show how the ability to control public perception and the power narrative is a timeless strategy from Augustus' days to modern times. In addition to propaganda and institutional control, another fundamental aspect of Augustus was his capacity for strategic concessions. Although he was an autocratic leader, he maintained the appearance that the Republic still functioned. He preserved the Senate and other Republican institutions, even though his power was practically absolute. This subtle use of power is something we also see in contemporary leaders, who often preserve the facade of democratic systems while concentrating power in their own hands. Today, many authoritarian regimes maintain parliaments and other democratic institutions in operation, but in practice, These bodies are weak and only serve to legitimize centralized power. An example of this is Turkey's system of government under Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Although Turkey retains a parliament, the concentration of power in the presidency and the reforms he has implemented over the years have undermined the independence of various institutions, leaving Erdogan as the supreme leader of the country, much like Augustus absorbed the power of the Roman Republic into his own hands. Therefore, when we compare Augustus with modern leaders, we realize that the principles of governance and power control haven't changed as much as we might imagine. The ability to use crises to justify reforms, control of public image, and manipulation of political institutions are strategies that transcend eras. The main difference is that the means to carry out these strategies have evolved, with digital media and social networks allowing for a more direct and immediate connection with the public. However, the underlying logic remains the same, ensuring stability and power through a combination of force, diplomacy, and narrative control. This comparative approach reveals that, although the political landscape has changed dramatically since Augustus' days, effective governance tactics remain remarkably consistent. By understanding how Augustus consolidated and maintained his power, we can gain valuable insights into modern leaders and the strategies they use to stay in control. This leads us to conclude that history indeed has much to teach us about the present, and Augustus continues to be a living example of how a leader can shape the future of a nation, even centuries after his death. This video not only illuminates the connections between the past and present, but also prompts reflection on the nature of power and how it's wielded, whether by emperors or presidents, in any era of history. Continuing with this comparative analysis between Augustus and modern leaders, it's essential to observe that one of Augustus' greatest strengths was his ability to adapt to political circumstances. He not only established himself as an effective ruler during a time of crisis, but also knew how to identify the needs of the moment and adapt his leadership style according to the demands of the Roman public. This pragmatism is something contemporary leaders need to master, especially in a world where political, economic, and social changes occur rapidly. A clear parallel with Augustus can be drawn with leaders who faced recent global crises, such as Angela Merkel during the Euro crisis and the migrant crisis in Europe. Like Augustus, who balanced the expectations of the Roman elite and the military with the needs of the common people, Merkel skillfully maintained a balance between the demands of her European partners, the financial sector, and the concerns of German voters. Although Merkel's context was quite different, her ability to handle a Europe in financial and social crisis is reminiscent of Augustus' approach, who pacified a fragmented empire. Augustus' political flexibility can also be seen in leaders who have faced legitimacy crises. For example, in contexts where there is dissatisfaction with the political system, Augustus' strategy of maintaining republican forms while effectively holding all the power can be compared to leaders who, even when facing significant opposition, seek to maintain the appearance of democracy or legitimacy. These leaders often use constitutional mechanisms or legislative reforms to concentrate power while preserving a democratic facade. This subtle balance of power was essential for Augustus and is a recurring theme in global contemporary politics. Additionally, the way Augustus expanded the empire without causing internal instability is a lesson many contemporary leaders attempt to emulate. Augustus' use of diplomacy and controlled military force, as well as his willingness to delegate tasks to trusted generals, can be seen in several modern powers that combine careful military interventions with robust diplomatic strategies. A contemporary example might be how the United States or China project power in critical regions of the world, maintaining careful control over how their interventions affect internal stability and global perceptions of their role. Another area where the comparison between Augustus and contemporary leaders becomes particularly relevant is in the realm of social and economic reforms. Augustus implemented several reforms that increased government efficiency and stabilized the Roman economy, creating a solid foundation for the future. Similarly, modern leaders facing economic crises often implement fiscal and institutional reforms that increase their popularity by improving their country's economic situation. For example, Franklin D. Roosevelt, during the Great Depression in the United States, implemented the New Deal to restore confidence in the economy. much like Augustus did in restoring confidence in the empire. These comparisons show that the ability to managing crises through structural reforms is a common characteristic among leaders who manage to stay in power for long periods. While Augustus transformed the Roman political system, modern leaders face similar challenges when trying to reform their own economies and governments to handle internal and external crises. In many cases, longevity in power depends not only on the implementation of these reforms, but also on how they are communicated to the public and accepted by society. Another point of connection between Augustus and modern leaders is the use of nationalism as a tool to unify the people. Augustus used the narrative that he was restoring traditional Roman values to legitimize his rule, something we see in many contemporary leaders. Nationalism, in many nations, is used to create a sense of unity and identity, even in times of internal divisions. Modern leaders like Narendra Modi in India or Donald Trump in the United States have used nationalist rhetoric to mobilize popular support, creating an emotional connection between national identity and their administrations, something Augustus brilliantly accomplished by portraying himself as Rome's savior. This emotional connection between the leader and the nation is also reflected in how Augustus was venerated during his rule. He used religion to associate himself with gods and Roman tradition, something that secured his place in the hearts of Roman citizens. In modern contexts, although secularism prevails in many countries, the idea of associating a leader with a national savior or the embodiment of a strong national identity remains an effective tactic. Creating a myth around a leader is something that transcends time and space, with Augustus establishing a model that leaders worldwide follow. Modern propaganda, such as that of authoritarian regimes that tightly control their leader's image, as in North Korea with Kim Jong-un, is an amplified version of what Augustus did by shaping his image as the perfect leader. However, even in democracies, this image building is critical. Sophisticated electoral campaigns and the use of digital platforms to control the narrative around a leader are an evolution of the propaganda Augustus mastered. The modern context allows for instant and amplified image creation, but the principle remains the same: create an emotional and powerful connection with the public to ensure political stability. Additionally, the way Augustus maintained the support of Roman elites while consolidating popular power also has clear parallels with leaders who must navigate between the interests of economic and political elites and the desire to meet the needs of the general population. In many modern contexts, this tension between pleasing elites and satisfying the people is the main challenge leaders face. And those who, like Augustus, can maintain this balance tend to be more successful in their administrations. In this video, we've seen how Augustus' strategies, which consolidated power throughout an empire on the brink of collapse, echo into the present day. Modern leaders faced with similar crises of legitimacy, stability, and identity often resort to tactics that Augustus mastered: deep reforms, image control, and careful manipulation of institutions. Although the contexts differ, Augustus' governance lessons continue to be a reference for any leader seeking not only to survive, but to thrive in times of crisis. This comparison shows that while the tools may have changed, from marble monuments to social media campaigns, the basic human needs for order, stability, and identity remain the same. Whether in ancient Rome or the contemporary world, political power is sustained through a combination of force, diplomacy, and narrative. Augustus established a model that, directly or indirectly, influences how today's leaders navigate the complexities of a constantly changing world. Thus, when we look at today's leaders, we can see clear reflections of Augustus in their actions, revealing that the essence of power remains timeless. Continuing with our comparative analysis between Augustus and contemporary leaders, it's essential to reinforce the structure of ideas in a fluid way, connecting previous themes while expanding the content, adding new insights on governance, communication, and political strategies. The aim here is not just to describe the similarities between Augustus and modern leaders, but to deepen how these parallels influence contemporary global political dynamics. A central point in Augustus' governance was his ability to manage legitimate crises. The collapse of the Roman Republic created a power vacuum, and Augustus' ability to fill it, reformulating Roman institutions, was one of his greatest achievements. He knew when to maintain the appearance of the republic and when to dissolve it, introducing a new form of power that, while centralized, was presented as a return to stability. In comparison, modern leaders oft, in the face of similar crises. Today, a leader facing legitimacy problems, whether due to political scandals, popular discontent, or economic crises, must adopt symbolic or institutional reform tactics. This includes manipulating laws, reorganizing the state apparatus, or even using nationalist appeals to legitimize their continued rule. For example, during the global economic crisis of 2008, many world leaders implemented broad political and economic reforms, seeking to balance public expectations and the weight of financial institutions. Like Augustus, these leaders knew how to turn crises into opportunities, adopting measures that not only addressed the immediate problem but also increased their control over the government. In Augustus' case, he reformed the distribution of land to soldiers and centralized economic power, thus increasing his popularity among the military and lower classes while consolidating the power of the elites. Similarly, economic reforms in modern times, like those implemented during the Eurozone crisis, reflect this attempt to harmonize public and elite demands. In addition to economic and political reforms, Augustus' ability to manipulate his public image is an aspect that is still reflected in modern leaders. Augustus understood, from early on, that to maintain control of Rome, he not only needed to be a good ruler, he needed to be seen as a savior, a restorer of order. This construction of a public image is a fundamental element of modern leadership. Today, politicians are advised by communication and marketing experts who shape their image through social media campaigns, and well-crafted speeches. While communication tools have changed from Augustus monuments and marble statues to digital platforms and social networks, the logic remains the same: control the narrative. This manipulation of public perception is also heavily based on the notion of historical narrative control. During Augustus' reign, he commissioned works of art, literature, and even historical records that portrayed his reign as a golden age, a period of rebirth and peace. Similarly, modern leaders seek to shape their legacy in much the same way, using the media to rewrite or reinterpret events, whether to boost their popularity or solidify their place in history. Today, we can see this in figures like Vladimir Putin, who frequently uses a historical narrative that glorifies Imperial Russia to justify his contemporary policies, or like Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who uses the glorification of the Ottoman past to create an emotional and political connection with his people. Legacy building is something that transcends eras and ideologies. Political leaders, regardless of their historical or cultural contexts, understand that their power resides not only in the present, but also in how they will be remembered in the future. This is something Augustus mastered brilliantly, associating himself with divine figures and promoting himself as the father of the nation. Today, the same strategy is visible in how many politicians try to consolidate their image with lasting legacies, whether through political achievements, massive infrastructure projects, or even through constitutional reforms. Deeper than image building, however, is the concept of nationalism as a tool for unification and control. Augustus used Roman pride to legitimize his rule, promoting himself as a leader who re-established Rome's values and glories. Today, nationalism continues to be a powerful tool for leaders who face internal divisions or external threats. Whether in the West or the East, politicians use nationalism to create an emotional connection between their leadership and the nation's destiny. The narrative that a country or its people need a strong leader to protect them against dangerous external or internal forces is as prevalent today as it was in Augustus' time. Leaders like Narendra Modi in India and Donald Trump in the United States have used this rhetoric to create a solid support base, often aligned with a strong sense of national identity. Just as Augustus used the Pax Romana to promote the idea of a strong and secure Rome, these modern leaders use national security policies, border control, and economic protectionism to create a feeling of protection and identity among their voters. When used effectively, nationalism can unite divided factions under a common banner, just as Augustus united Rome under his leadership after years of civil wars. Another convergence point between Augustus and modern leaders is the importance of militarism and diplomacy in their administrations. Although Augustus led several military campaigns, he was as skilled at the negotiating table as he was on the battlefield. He knew how to forge strategic alliances, both internal and external, to ensure that his enemies were defeated or assimilated over time. This balance between military strength and diplomacy can be observed in many contemporary global powers, such as the United States, which blends military interventions with robust diplomacy to maintain its position on the international stage. Furthermore, the use of social and economic reforms to create a lasting support base was one of Augustus' main characteristics, and it is also a widely used tactic today. He introduced measures that favored both soldiers and ordinary citizens, such as land reorganization and increased popular participation in certain aspects of public administration, as a way to pacify and satisfy the people. Modern leaders frequently use income redistribution policies, social programs, or infrastructure investments to gain and maintain popular support, especially during times of crisis. Finally, it is essential to highlight that although Augustus ruled in a completely different context, many of his strategies are timeless and are still adapted and employed by leaders worldwide. Control of narratives, manipulation of institutions, the use of nationalism, a combination of diplomacy and militarism, and the implementation of social and economic reforms are tactics that continue to be employed by leaders seeking to stay in power, whether in democratic or authoritarian regimes. These parallels show that studying Augustus is not just an analysis of a historical leader, but also a window into understanding how power is exercised in any context, be it political, economic, or social. The way leaders position themselves, adapt their strategies in times of crisis, and consolidate their legacy reflects a historical continuity in the art of governance. Even in a rapidly changing world, Augustus' lessons remain valid, demonstrating that the dynamics of power, politics, and leadership transcend time and remain incredibly relevant to this day. This comparative exploration not only reveals the similarities between the past and the present, but also invites us to reflect on how power and leadership strategies are shaped and reshaped according to the challenges of the moment. Just as Augustus shaped Rome and its future, contemporary leaders, by learning from the past, can find new ways to face present challenges and perhaps shape the future's course just as enduringly.